you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
What's going on, you guys? Today we have David Pakman confronting Dr. Phil for being a conservative. David Pakman completely demolishes the MAGA nut Dr. Phil as far as his values, as far as he's retreating from actually standing up, saying he's a conservative. He's saying that he has these conservative values, but as soon as David Pakman decides to question him on it, Dr. Phil decides to retreat, and we can see right here.
Today we'll be speaking with Phil McGraw, also known as Dr. Phil, host of Dr. Phil Prime Time on Merritt Street Media, and author of the new book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. You know, I'm very interested to speak to you today because in preparation for our interview, I've been watching some of the Fox News appearances, looking at the book, etc. I never really saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because I am so not political, you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And, and I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through. Couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
That's
I'm just
interesting.
willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it.
I don't want to make this like, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and
So here we have Dr. Phil sort of denying that he is a conservative, that he's not talking about anything political. He's talking more about the culture. And little by little, we're going to see David Pakman dismantle what Dr. Phil is speaking for. David Pakman can sort of see through what Dr. Phil is saying as far as, oh, I'm not a conservative. I'm just pushing nothing but conservative values. And let's keep on going.
others. It seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual decisions in the style that many Republicans now talk about with regard to schooling and parenting, et cetera. But you're saying it's just not the case.
No, and that doesn't mean that there aren't politicians on both sides of the aisle that talk about these issues. But if you really think about raising a family in America, whether it's now or 50 years ago or 20 years down the road, we still have to keep our eye on what I think are core issues in America. And I think the backbone of America is the family unit. I really think that if we have strong families, if we have strong family values, and I think that our families in America, as you've heard me say and read me say, are under attack. And I think some of those attacks are unintended consequences of technology, for example. But these are things that, whether politicians talked about them or not, if they tried to legislate about them or not, I would still be talking about.
So give some examples of that. What are some of the attacks facing families?
Well, I think about 08, 09, we had had what I think has been the biggest change to human life since the Industrial Revolution. I think before the Industrial Revolution, we were a very agricultural civilization, right? People worked on the farms. We grew what we needed. But then we became mechanized, and I think back then we were 95% agricultural. Now we're 1% agricultural. Why? Because everything is so mechanized and people move to the cities and all. Well, the biggest thing that's happened since then, in my opinion, was the advent of the smartphone. The internet became so prolific.
Make sure you guys like and subscribe for more.
And I mean, think about it. We're walking around in 08, 09 with as much computing power in our hands with smartphones, laptops, iPads, that we had when we did the moon shot. When we put a man on the moon, we didn't have as much computing power as we can hold in our hands as of 08, 09, and it changed everything. And people stopped being so involved with the reality of life and started getting involved in virtual life. And it's only gone more and more in that direction since that time. And also at that time, we started seeing the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people since records were kept. And
I'm with you on this
changed.
one. I'm with you on this one. Jonathan Haidt has studied and written about this extensively. You and I are aligned on this one. What about the ones that fall under what you call the tyranny of the fringe? Because I don't think the smartphone example falls under that category, right?
No, that's why I say some of this is the unintended consequences of like technology. But then we've got some where we've got people that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history, we want to change what kids are being taught in history, we want to change biology, we want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more about, I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, you know, pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Now, just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
So at this point, Dr. Phil is sort of taking just a boomer stance. He's saying things, the good old days, back in the good old days, they were, you know, we didn't have smartphones and the kids didn't, you know, want to use TikTok and the femboys and you know, he might as well just start name dropping anything crazy. But we see that Dr. Phil really is spewing conservative ideology without putting the conservative name on it. I think David Pakman is doing a great way of letting Dr. Phil sort of speak his truth, say what he wants to say, and then we'll see David Pakman enlighten Dr. Phil on what he's actually saying. You know, he is, whether he wants to admit it or not, Dr. Phil is sort of making an us versus them argument, especially whenever he uses words such as fringe culture. You know, we'll see David Pakman start to key in on these ideas.
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind. Yeah. We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation. Right. This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time. are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure.
Dr. Phil clearly does not know what he wants. That's why it's always difficult to talk about these difficult issues if you don't really know anything about it. Dr. Phil is advocating for one thing when it's clear that he's wanting something else. David Pakman is brilliantly confronting Dr. Phil on the issue, as well as having him sort of think outside and explain what it is that he really wants. And as soon as he wants him to explain what it is that he really wants, we have Dr. Phil sort of at a loss for words, sort of saying, well, it's not as simple as, well, of course it's not as simple. Maybe that's why we shouldn't be talking about it as uneducated as we are.
Measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time. That's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting.
So there we have it, guys. We have Dr. Phil sort of coming out of his shell as a right-wing conservative. He should always have just stuck to that from the beginning, but we can see, whether he sees it or not, that he is advocating for conservative values sort of in relation to libertarian values. He is not talking about wanting, he's not sort of talking about all these positive changes in a manner that is positive, that he doesn't seem excited about all this at all. He seems that, oh crap, I'm going to get caught up because I'm not, I might have to change as a person. I don't want to have to change. God forbid I have to change as a person. So maybe I should critique the libertarian values. He's a conservative without saying that he's a conservative. Dr. Phil and David Pakman had a great discussion. I'm glad that David Pakman was able to confront Dr. Phil on this manner. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And yep, see you guys tomorrow.